Brewster here with a new episode of Soloing Secrets, and this is Pat Travers, and I've had some requests to feature more from this legendary guitarist. It was 3 or 4 years ago when I featured Pat in a 3-for-all lesson, and this lesson is going to be a deep dive into his soloing style, and then I'm going to follow this with a chord play for Pat Travers. So I'm currently in full-on Pat Travers mode, which is awesome. And Pat's career started around 1970 in Toronto, Canada. Over the course of his career, he's released 26 studio albums, 16 live albums, and 11 compilations. And in the 70s, the Pat Travers band with Pat Thrall, on second guitar, they definitely dominated and just rocked the 70s. Very influential and very important, too. So just like we've done in other episodes in the Soloing Secrets series, when you're checking out a certain player like Pat Travers, it's always a good idea to kind of scope out his musical influences, which kind of reveal certain things that pop up in his music. And here's an image with some of Pat Travers' elusive musical influences, and notice we've actually featured most of these players in the Soloing Secrets series. And with a career that dates back to 1970, Pat's worked with a whole bunch of different musicians and artists, whether on his solo albums or kind of a guest appearance and stuff like that. And here's an image with some of the people that Pat's worked with in his career. And notice the great drummers, Tommy Aldridge and Carmen Appice and people like that. Total legend. And as far as Pat's actual soloing secrets, the things he typically does with a guitar in his hands, and there's a lot: modified blues phrasing, various pentatonic scales, hybrid pentatonic scales, emotive bending and vibrato, repeating licks and legato licks and fast picking, use of effects and feedback and slide guitar and a whole bunch of stuff. But here's Pat Travers' Soloing Secrets. So the music and licks and soloing ideas shared in this episode actually came from the first 2 Pat Travers albums, his self-titled debut from 1976 and the album Makin Magic, which is on the wall right there, from 1977. Classic, historic Pat Travers albums, and I felt like those 2 definitely deliver a good template or blueprint as far as Pat Travers, musical style. The licks and the solos and the riffs and all that stuff. Great historic guitar music, and that's where the music and ideas I'm sharing in this lesson came from. With the opening, that was me playing around with the song Feelin Right. That's like the interlude that begins around 2:11 in that song, and that's from Pat Travers' first album. And I am going to uncover the rhythm part from the first part of the song in the Pat Travers chord play I'm going to follow this lesson with. But this is that interlude that starts around 2:11. Starts with power chords right there. And you got this kind of bouncy single note riff. Okay, so that G, F, G, B flat, up to that C, and then B flat, C at the end there. And then the riff. Now you're kind of playing with that F and G. You also open up that low E there. And then like the flat 5, that C, B flat down to that F. Double stop slide there, 3 to 5 on the D and the G string. And then you do the power chords again, but end with B flat, G the second time. Like that. Do the same single note riff. And then right there, it basically starts this flat 5 climbing thing. And it stops on E right there. So you're starting with like a B flat, flat 5, or I'm sorry, a B flat 5. And you're just climbing up, right? Ascending, then there's a C flat 5, C sharp, D sharp, and then end on that E. And that's when I kicked on the MXR clone looper. And there's a rhythm part behind that. It starts with that like E, or he's doing so that rhythm part behind is just E, D, and A, and like A sus4 playing with it like that. Like that. So once that rhythm part starts, then I did jump into Pat's actual solo from the song there, and he's basically climbing up like that, and then he starts doing this. Kind of jamming there at the end, but he does that climb up with those flat fives, and then he does this. So after that little, and then, so right there, it's kind of intervallic, and then he just basically does like an open G to that A note trill, and then this big bend down there in open position. And he's basically spelling out like an E major triad like that, but melodically. And then like that. And then he starts doing this kind of slip and slide thing. Right there, that's where I start kind of jamming, and I basically moved up here. And right there I was doing this. And right there, that's definitely a Pat Travers signature kind of flat five lick. He stole that from Jimmy Page right there, but that's definitely something Pat did a lot in his music. And then I basically moved into E major pentatonic right there. And then I did it again right there in E major. And I kind of just ended up with that, like, you know, minor to major third, and then ended that E right there. Like that. So I'm just basically serving up part of Pat's solo and then some additional stuff that I kind of added, like that little kind of rapid, you know, flat five, kind of pentatonic or blues lick. So that was interesting because I did that lick in like minor pentatonic with the flat five. And then I did it again in the major pentatonic right there with that G and that F sharp. So that's definitely kind of a signature move from Pat Travers, even though he totally stole that from Jimmy Page. But that's a classic lick, and that's a classic song too. Next up is one of Pat's signature speed licks, and this takes place in the song Makes No Difference from the first Pat Travers album, and we're basically doing this. You know, something like that. So the speed lick right there, you know, a little slower looks and sounds like that. So it's just crammed in there. And it goes right back in that riff. Like that. So that's really interesting. Think like A blues kind of scale there. So you're grabbing that E flat right there. And then like that. And the way it all kind of flows and kind of crammed together. But it's just crammed, right? And then later in the same song, you hear the same lick, but an octave lower. So there it is there. And then you hear it again later. Like that, the exact same thing. that. So here it is higher. And then an octave lower right there. And both times you hear it in that song, it's just crammed in there. It's definitely a handful, and you're going to hear Pat Travers do that kind of stuff. Those tight, fast, and fluid licks just flying around all over the place. Okay, next up are some licks from the song Stop and Smile from the first Pat Travers album. And this first one's this clucky, kind of funky blues lick like this. Reminds me of Joe Walsh or somebody like that. So you're doing this kind of half-step smear bend on that F sharp and the G. And you're going to basically, grab this B on the high E right there after you do the bend. And then there's a noticeable kind of like cluck or pluck right there, like a muted pick on that F sharp. So you're basically clucking it, and then you're going to bend that, half step, and then you're going to release that half step bend back to that E note. Like that. And I'm basically mashing, my pick against the strings and muting that string when I get the cluck. Like that. So it's just kind of aggressively muted, I guess. Like that. Now the other lick here from the song, there's actually two more licks, but the next lick is kind of a modification of the signature speed lick we just looked at, but this is a little slower, and he's doing like that. So very similar to what we just looked at in the previous example, but there we're starting with that shift slide. Kind of slow. So definitely Pat seemed really fond of that phrase and that kind of sequence of notes. And then this last lick, this is definitely a lost trick right here. So he's doing a trill. This takes place a little bit later in the song. He's doing a trill between this B and D note. And he reaches behind the trill on that string and he pulls the B string sharp. And he ends with that D, whole step bend right there. So trill the note and then reach behind it and grab the B string and literally pull it away from the fretboard, and you'll hear that trill go higher. And then bend that, like I said, that D to E a whole step. And you can definitely catch lots of 70s and early 80s guitarists, playing licks like that. Randy Rhoads was known for doing that too. But there's Pat Travers doing the behind the trill bend. Really cool and kind of a lost lick or an idea right there. Next up is the interlude before the solo in the song Makin Magic from the album by the same name. And it starts with the Hendrix chord, and you've got this busy kind of blues lick, and then the solo starts like this. Something like that. So think the Hendrix chord, E7 sharp 9 right there. Bang the low E, the chord once, low E, the chord twice. Then we're moving into this little part of A major right there. So you're kind of sliding into the triad and separating the notes. And then there's pull-offs right there. Like that. And you go right back to the chord riff. Nothing really hard to play there, but that sets up the solo, which we're getting ready to look at the opening of the solo next. And then right after that riff, you hear the start of the solo from Makin Magic, like this. One more time. Obviously an E right there, and he's starting with this compound bend, right? Holding that D note on the B and then bending that A up to B, on the G string, like that. So he basically starts bending it, then he starts picking it more, and then he bends and releases that A note and ends up on that E right there. Then he slides into that E note and starts tremolo picking that G note there on the G string 4 times. And then he starts doing his signature flat 5 pull-off lick, which I played this during the opening jam, but this little number, which he totally stole that from Jimmy Page, but there it is. And then he starts doing, he just kind of ends it like that. So when you hear all that together, something like that. It's badass. Next up's the intro to the song Stevie from the album Makin Magic, and this isn't a guitar solo, but there are two guitars harmonizing, doing this kind of open string arpeggio melodic idea, and I grabbed it because I was like, that's really cool and kind of unusual. And there's two guitars here, so I'm going to use the MXR clone looper again to help me out. And guitar 1, we're basically playing with A minor, E minor, A minor, and then eventually E major. So we've got this kind of chord progression happening with the shift, in the tonality. But the guitar 1's doing, like that. So it's A minor right there, and then E minor right there, that B, G, and that high E open. And then repeat A minor again. And then right there, that B, A, and the high E open. And then that B, G sharp to the high E open for E major. Like that. So that's guitar 1. Guitar 2 is actually up here, so harmonized it looks and sounds like this. Something like that. That's really cool. So up there you got that E, C, and the E. And then right there that D, B, and the high E open for the E minor 7, I guess implied. And then right back to that E, C, and E. And then right there it's E, B, E, and you're basically doubling that for both this part. But you're doing that a little stretchier there for sure from the 7th to the 12th. But that's a really cool guitar part. Like I said, there's no screaming guitar solo, but when I heard that, I was like, man, that's really cool. And it kind of inspired me to investigate, trying to explore that and maybe turn that into a different lick or part of a solo or something. But that's really cool stuff right there. Alright, last but not least are two crammed pentatonic licks from the historic song Boom Boom Out Go the Lights. We're back on the first Pat Travers album. And these are related even though they're different licks, but they're both in E minor pentatonic and they kind of have a similar start. And of course the ending and the flows a little bit differently. The first one's like this. One more time. So at the end, it's interesting because he's ending on the 5 chord, that B note right there. But as far as that first part, he's doing this rolling like hammer-on. And then there's his signature like flat 5 lick again. So kind of slowly it looks like that. Let me do it again all the way through real slow. It's just crammed in there. Something the other pentatonic speed lick from Boom Boom I'll Go the Lights. I think this takes place around 223, and it's something like this. One more time. So once again, super busy, and it actually starts the same way as the previous lick, but instead of on the D and the G string, now we're on the B and the high E right there. So we're grabbing that E note and then hammering on that B to D, which is similar to what we had with that G and then the hammer on D to E. But now we're up there. So you got 4 of those. And then he's doing, and that's kind of awkward at first. Because you got that kind of string crossing thing like right in the middle of it. Like that. And then you're coming down basically a really common pentatonic sequence right there. And at the end, you basically stop with that B, A, and then slide off that G right there. Like that. So both of those licks are just pentatonic based and just crammed in that little space. And then the second one. And definitely Pat Travers was known for just cramming licks in those tight little spaces for fills, during guitar solos, all kinds of stuff. Pat's a master and a badass guitarist. Alright, that's going to wrap this episode of Soloing Secrets with this look at Pat Travers, and I have to admit, I've dove deeper into Pat's music than I ever have. I've definitely been aware of him for a very long time. It was actually Paul Gilbert that kind of clued me in to who Pat Travers is. And, you know, reading guitar, you know, interviews and stuff with Paul Gilbert, and he would mention people like Robin Trower and Michael Schenker, Uli John Roth, and then he would mention Pat Travers. And I remember when I was a kid, like, who's Pat Travers? And then I looked him up and started checking him out. Powerhouse, you know, fiery guitarist, you know, and early, like, technique and kind of shreddy, like, blues rock guitarist. And definitely inspired tons of players to push their technique and start playing faster. You know, think of players like Gary Moore and some of these guys, you know, definitely known for playing blues and blues rock, but then also known for just whipping it out and just shredding, just throwing down. You know, Gary Moore wasn't afraid to do it. Pat Travers is definitely not afraid to do it. And tons of other players too, Uli John Roth and some of those people I just mentioned, Michael Schenker. But there's something cool about that, like just hyperactive, shreddy blues, I guess, or hyperactive, you know, blues rock with lots of technique. It's really cool. So anyway, leave some feedback and comments. Please subscribe to Night Lessons, and I'll be back before you know with more content and material. Thank you.